Hello, beautiful community. A big kerfuffle in the pro-Ukraine internet about this. A piece that seemed to argue that Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory could backfire and lead to further Putin escalation. Now, what we're going to do is going to be lopsided. We're going to start with the reaction and the backlash to the piece, then we're going to look at the piece. But we're not going to do all of this with an eye on a kind of a glib, self-satisfactory score card that we give everyone involved. What we're rather going to do is try to get some big picture takeaways that are green vegetables for us and help us understand not just the Russo-Ukrainian war, but how we talk about it, and also how we talk about war and politics more generally. I'm a little bit struggling to breathe, but breathing well enough not to be on oxygen, so you're going to help me get through. We're going to be powered by sparkling mineral water and disempowered by, again, the theft of my microphone by my beautiful wife. So, let's rock and roll. This is the piece. The title was Ukraine's Audacious Attacks May Just Play into Putin's Hands. Now, the author here, Mark Galeotti, has not written the title. It's very important to understand this. When I speak to, let's imagine I was going to speak to the Sun, I could say that a regime like Putin's, the Sun newspaper, a regime like Putin's is stable until it isn't, and then it could rapidly collapse over a 6-month period. The title might be British Vlad says Kremlin Vlad's about to lose power in a violent coup. So understand that that's the dynamic. A second thing to understand is that this is rolling commentary. A lot of these pieces you see are done very quickly. This is not like Bob Silver's asking Alfred Brendel or Isaiah Berlin to write an essay for the New York Review of Books in 1979, where the notion is write it when you're happy with it, it'll come. This is something that's written very quickly, and that means that somewhere in between that kind of piece by Alfred or Isaiah and a YouTube comment. Right, it's somewhere in the middle. So there is no point in reading it like it's some kind of treatise in which every sentence does a sort of impregnable and fully intentional job. Now, before looking what's inside the piece, let's look at the reaction. Here, Sasha Retkind is saying, poor Putin, he must be so unhappy. How can we comfort him? Is perturbed by Ukraine's attacks on Russian territory. Ian Garner says, another Galeotti special. This time he is here to tell us why Ukrainian attacks help Russia's war hawks, who have needed no excuse to demand escalation for years. Ukrainian attacks are not playing into Putin's hands, as the headline puts it, because there is no cause and effect, no logical reasoning behind Russia's aggression against Ukraine. If they want to escalate, they will. If they don't, they won't. You can see two things immediately here in Ian's post. On the one hand, he is reaching for something explanatorily important, right? On the other hand, because this is Twitter, of course it can't be the case that there is any meaningful human action without logical reasoning, right? This is Twitter. Ilya Ponomarenko. If Ukrainian retaliatory strikes on Russia now provoke Kremlin escalation and give the hawks in the Kremlin and Putin a chance to resort to ever greater brutality, then what the hell has been happening since 2022, when Ukraine couldn't even dream of responding to Russia and Russian territory properly, and still Russians were doing all kinds of terrible things and escalating, basically. That's origami. The premise that Ukraine stopped strikes, that if Ukraine stopped strikes on Russian territory, this was de-escalate the war, is wrong. Russia has steadily increased the scale and intensity of its attacks since 2022, regardless of what Ukraine's done. Konstantin Sonin, in response to Ukraine's audacious attacks, Putin may invade Ukraine. Oh no, he's already done that. Strike Kiev with ballistic. Oh, he's already done that. And Mark responds, are these things that I actually say in the article? And Konstantin then semi-backtracks. So we're getting a sense of the kerfuffle. Strange logic. Should Ukraine do less in order to hope that Putin will respond accordingly? And this is much the weakest of the critical comments because it's not based on reading Mark's piece at all. And if that sort of behavior happens to you once or twice a year, no issue at all. If you're doing it all the time, you're part of a kind of informational environment disease that we have, because you can't respond to the titles of pieces rather than the pieces regularly if you're older than 12. Under 12 is permissible. You probably shouldn't be using social media then. Some people defending Mark. Vlad Davidson says, Mark is beautiful, and Mark is beautiful. It doesn't make Mark right or wrong about this. And a little bit more. Is Russia then just a force of nature with no internal logic to be studied? I'm not sure I agree with this, especially as a Russianist myself, if we're to assume there is no cause and effect in Russian policy. So it's a bit of a response. Now, let's begin getting into the piece ourselves. We'll read it, and where it feels like it's got facts and just, filler information, we're going to skip those bits. So let's begin reading together. Ukraine's deep strikes are reaching further into Russia than ever. A logistics hub for the online marketplace Wildberries was hit in Yekaterinburg on Friday, more than 1,200 miles from the border. Kyiv hopes that this campaign shakes Russian morale, but the danger is that it may play into the hands of hawks, encouraging President Putin not to freeze the conflict, but to escalate it. Let's read before we analyze a little bit more. There is no questioning the technical success of Ukraine's campaign. Examples. More recently, Ukraine has pivoted to striking buildings belonging to Wildberries, Russia's Amazon, and many of these have been hit. More stuff hit in Russia. Ukraine has also limited drone and missile stocks. It has to reallocate assets from its campaign against the oil refineries to the e-commerce industry campaign. And the long queues for petrol have, perhaps as a consequence of this, eased in Russia, Mark Galeotti says. But this is also a political as much as an economic campaign intended to bring the war home to Russians. That has undoubtedly happened. The attacks have been front-page news much of the last month. The effect has been polarizing. According to the pollster Levada, last month the proportion of Russians who believe the war is going well fell. Levada also noted that Putin's approval ratings a tiny bit fell. 17 pinches of salt when we refer to Levada poll numbers in Russia. However, there is also growing anger among the Russian people, directed not so much at Putin as at Ukraine. While most favor freezing the conflict and opening negotiations, there is also a sizable minority who feel that, if anything, efforts should be increased against Ukraine. In particular, there's a growing tally of Russian civilian casualties that's playing into the hawks' hands. Let's jump a bit on. In the first 6 months of the year, Moscow reported more civilian casualties. There are still more in Ukraine, but the numbers in Russia are growing. Much more in Ukraine, of course, but the numbers in Russia are growing. Putin's goal is to legitimate the war and any future escalation. His original implicit promise that Russia would not be forced to experience the war unless they chose to volunteer is, no longer applies. And now there could be a new cynical approach based on vengeance, and it might be more effective in shoring up support for the regime and justifying unpopular moves such as mobilization of reservists to make up for the current shortfall in recruitment. Already Russia is fighting fire with fire. So there is some kind of change to Russian behavior, Russia's attacks on Ukrainian territory as a consequence of Ukraine's attacks on Russian territory, presumably. But what kind of change we can debate. At the end of June, Zelensky launched a 40-day deep strike campaign against Russia in order to compel it to end the war, in quote marks. Of course, Zelensky believes no such thing himself. He needed to be able to show Ukraine's Western allies. It was a gamble, but arguably a necessary one. And above all, Zelensky needed to be able to show Ukraine's Western allies, and above all, skeptical Trump, that he had cards. At the same time, there's a genuine sense in some quarters of Kiev that simmering discontent within the Russian elite could be brought to the surface by deep strikes against highly visible economic targets. Attempts to demoralize a nation and force it to sue for peace through airstrikes can succeed, but only if they deliver truly shattering blows. Here, the bombing of Japan with nuclear weapons is contrasted with the Blitz. The deep strikes are undoubtedly undermining Putin's credibility and degrading his economy, and thus the war machine. But they're also driving pragmatic and technocratic figures within the elite into increasingly open calls for restraint and an end to the fighting. And we discussed an example of this when Mr. Sobyanin spoke out, the Moscow mayor, a few days ago. But the hawks are also using this campaign as grounds to urge Putin into an even uglier escalatory stage of the war. Putin may now feel he has greater license to mobilize more troops for an autumn campaign with less fear of a popular backlash, and he may even go further in his hybrid war against the West. And Ukraine's considered gamble might lead Putin to make a rather more dangerous one of his own. Actually, no. Let's keep the glasses on. Let's come back a little bit to the social media reaction. Galeotti says that the war hawks will be encouraged by Ukraine's attacks on Russia. Russia has been retaliating all along, escalating all along, even though Ukraine didn't have much capacity to bomb Russia. The premise that if Ukraine stopped, or stopped to some degree, that this would de-escalate the war is wrong. You know, look at all these things Putin did without Ukraine having capacity to extend the war onto Russian territory. Now let's do a little bit of very minor observation first, and then I'll try to give you a reaction of how I feel, which I'm still processing. I'm still processing what I make of this piece. Now, you can't deny the fact that Ukraine's attacks on Russian territory, right, are going to impact Russia's actions. To say there is no causal effect there is Twitter speak, right? It's not real. The question is, what's the causal effect? You can argue it can alter the timing of Russian escalation. You can argue that it can refract its purposes somehow. They were doing one thing, now they're doing another thing. They're bombing more of one kind of target, now they're going to bomb another kind of target. But then you can also make the case, and that's a bigger claim to make, that it accelerates Russian escalation. And then you're going to have to make the case that accelerating Russian escalation is inherently bad for Ukraine. And certainly if we talk about Russia extending its hybrid war onto Europe, or even going further than just extending Russia's hybrid war into Europe, indeed attacking something in Poland or in the Baltics, it's unclear that Ukraine's government would find that bad. It would find the expansion and globalization of the war advantageous. The Germans, the French, and the Brits might not, but it would. At the same time, it's not clear whether a Russian mobilization will or will not be advantageous for Ukraine. We just don't know that, right? So Ukraine might say, well, we don't want Russia to mobilize, but then they're going to have to see how it works out. Ukraine might say, well, we do want Russia to mobilize because it'll destabilize them in various ways they can't control, and therefore we do want them to mobilize, but we don't know what will happen, right? There is significant concession here by Mark Galeotti about what Ukraine is gaining from these attacks. And Mark also implies that there might be a modicum of necessity to these attacks, because Ukraine's got to do what Ukraine's got to do. But he also says that there is a risk that they could backfire. That, in other words, victim here could be the Ukrainian civilian population, for instance. You could construct various other arguments. And it would be additionally victimized by Russian aggression, right? Which escalates in response to Ukraine doing various things on Russian territory that don't give it a significant enough advantage for it to be worth, sacrificing the extra suffering that this might trigger among Ukrainian civilians from the additional, escalatory Russian attacks. And so this could backfire. I am not impressed with the criticism of Galeotti's piece, but I don't share the perspective of Galeotti's piece either. I don't share either of the perspectives we have looked at, I think. Why? What I'm seeing in the comments, in the social media comments, is two things. I'm seeing a point about the disconnect between what Russia does and Ukrainian operations in Russian territory that is not in every one of these social media posts, but in many of them excessively made, right? Almost to the point of denying the way Ukrainian operations refract Russia's actions. But then I'm seeing something else. A feeling that something is wrong with Mark Galeotti's piece, but I don't quite know what it is, so I'm going to say something quickly here on Twitter. Now, when we speak about different kinds of pieces, the question I always recommend you to start with is, can I get something out of this? Rather than can I glibly declare that somebody is just wrong or useless in the information environment. Because that's conducive to growth. The other thing is conducive to gamification. And it also is very important to understand that whether something is a good thing to say in an information environment depends on how many people are saying it. I often get emails, and I was actually planning to do a chat like that. Hey, Vlad, react to the latest thing Greta Thunberg has said, and isn't it really weird? In the sense that if you were to say that, Vlad, then that would be quite weird for you, and you wouldn't like saying it. So doesn't that mean that what she's saying is terrible? No, it doesn't, because she's not me. She's a completely different kind of act in informational environment. And what we've got to understand is that when we assess what people say, we've got to pay attention to the cumulative economy of online discourse. You want a fruit bowl with a lot of different fruit. You don't want to freak out that the oranges in your bowl can't be plums and pears. You just want to have plums and pears. And you don't want to have a bowl full of oranges. So it might be good to have 2 oranges, but not good to have 22 oranges. Right? That's how the information environment works. Now, would I say, hey man, this stuff Ukraine is doing just risks backfiring for it? No, I wouldn't. Why wouldn't I? I wouldn't, because for me, something would feel off about it. What is that? Let's try to approach this now. There is a certain sense in which Ukrainian escalation on Russian territory is Russian escalation. It's a consequence of Russia's war and Russia's escalatory actions. So there is a sense in which what Ukraine is doing in Russian territory is something that Russia is doing. We don't want to make this a rhetorical point, so where can we go with this? Remember again that this is a piece in between a YouTube comment and properly written out essay that you spend 2 months writing and you're happy with every word on the page. The impression this piece gives, right, is an impression of a disbalance of agency between Russia and Ukraine. And I'm not saying that the piece is positioned intellectually inside that disbalance, but that it veers into it. And that's what feels to me analytically off about it. I've had brain inflammation since 2003, and it's got worse in the last year and a half. So my analogies are horrific. So let's start with a horrific analogy. Imagine that Ricky is fighting Bobby on the street. And Ricky has attacked Bobby, hurt Bobby, but Bobby's punched Ricky in the face. And now we're witnessing this, and we try to see what's going on with Ricky and his role in the fight. And we're saying, wow, Ricky's just got punched in the face, so it looks like he might now be reaching for the crowbar he sees across the pavement. Okay, but what about Bobby's next move? Well, Bobby's next move should be a calibration of what he should do that is going to generate the best possible consequences for him in the fight. Something has gone wrong here. There is a much more behaviorist description of Ricky. That happens to Ricky, so he's probably going to do this. And there is a much more contextualized description of Ricky. That's to say, Ricky's conduct is described from within the rich context of the pulls and pushes acting on him, whereas Bobby's behavior is described almost as though he were an over-idealized, disembodied intelligence, right? Dispensing actions calibrated to realize the most advantageous consequences. There is a disbalance of the rendering of agency in the fight in the description we have given. And so there is an inflection in this piece that gives us a behaviorist picture of Russia. This has happened to them, so then they're going to do that. And a deeply contextualized picture of the piece, a deeply contextualized picture of Russia, whereby they're under all of these pulls and pushes, and these pulls and pushes are going to produce particular ways that they have of going on and taking the next step. Ukraine is captured less behavioralistically. This happened to them, so they're going to do that. And with less context. They're under these pulls and pushes. And that's going to generate them to go in this and that direction. It's more a picture of some kind of somewhat detached dial that Ukraine can increase or decrease, that estimates consequences that are going to be advantageous or not advantageous for it. They're disanalogous descriptions of the two agents involved. So what would happen if Machiavelli or Thucydides read this piece? They would say that what it gives a disbalanced picture of is how far Ukraine is going to do what it's going to do because it's going to do what it's going to do, and no, that's not tautological. In the one picture, Russia is immersed in the contingency and the necessity and the context of war. In the other picture, there's a slightly over-idealized conception of Ukraine, somewhat detached from these contingencies and necessities. Thucydides would feel, if he teleported himself into our historical moment, well, firstly, he'd be terrified of you, but not as much as you would be terrified of him. Yeah, they have very, very scary ideas about human conduct. It would freak you out. But apart from that, he would say, look, when you've got a war going on, motive, what overall motivates a side to go on the way it goes on, is a complex thing, and it's one thing. Another thing, a second thing, is let's put a placeholder here, rationalization a side gives to itself and to the world of its own actions. How it reflectively understands its purposes. That's not the same thing, that's motives. And then there's third, the action it takes. And what Thucydides says is that all of these three deeply interpenetrate. Action you take transforms your motives and transforms your reflective understanding of what you're doing. And all three are partly distinct, but also enter a kind of wash. And so there is a disbalance in the way the piece comes off, which creates a more Thucydidean picture of the Russian side, and then a picture of a Ukrainian side as though it were put through some kind of calculus of abstraction borrowed from the early writings of Rawls. That's the last thing Mark Galeotti would do. So this is just an inflection that resonates off the page too much there for me. That then is becomes a kind of abstracted faucet that calibrates, proper and improper degrees of escalation, having considered the possible consequences of them, right? So there's a more behaviorist picture and a more contextualized picture of the one side, and there's a more idealized and abstracted picture of the other side. I suppose one favorable thing to say here about that inflection in the piece is that, well, maybe the piece treats Ukraine as being more us, and therefore it puts it into that kind of more detached, abstracted bubble, whereas it doesn't with the Russians because they're the them. I don't think that can go too far. So there is a disbalance in the implication about the agency of the two sides. And whether the people who've been critical of the piece or not, whether people who've been critical of the piece are aware of it or not, for many of them that is partly what has triggered them, though they can't articulate it. Ukraine is deeply embedded in necessity and contingency. This is not something the piece analytically denies, but it veers into a kind of evasion of it. So are the Russians. You got both, right? And if you abstract away that abstraction you take it away and don't apply it to Ukraine, right? I do think saying, oh, doing that could backfire, comes to be a lot less plausible. It comes to sound like a misunderstanding of agency in war. And that's where my discomfort comes from that. That's why I wouldn't say that. Because it wouldn't ring true to me. Because it would generate the feel of a different way to speaking about the agency of the two sides, which I want to speak about in the same way. Now, I don't know where that's landed for you, but I wanted to give you something that might be elevating beyond just doing a score where I give somebody 2 or 9 out of 10 for the comment they've made. I hope this has been helpful. Lots of love and talk very soon.